The autumn rain hammered against the windshield as Dr. Sarah Chen drove through the winding mountain roads of Ashford County, Virginia. Her GPS had lost signal, leaving her with only a hand-drawn map from the Historical Society. Sarah was a forensic anthropologist from Boston University. 3 months ago, she discovered a daguerreotype in a Civil War archive, the Holloway Twins, 1870, Ashford County, Virginia. 2 young women in Victorian dresses stood against a plain backdrop. But something was wrong. Margaret Holloway, the sister on the left, had her right hand resting on a shoulder. The angle was impossible. It was resting on her own shoulder from behind, an impossible position for a human arm. Sarah had analyzed the photograph for weeks, consulting medical professionals, photo historians. Every analysis pointed to the same conclusion. Either the photograph had been manipulated, or something deeply disturbing had occurred. The road narrowed into Ashford, population 347. The Historical Society was housed in a converted church, white paint peeling to reveal grey wood. Sarah parked and ran through the rain, her laptop bag clutched against her chest. The door opened before she could knock, and a woman in her 60s appeared, backlit by warm yellow light. "Dr. Chen, Martha Holloway. We spoke on the phone." The woman's voice was pleasant, but carried an undertone of something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Wariness, perhaps, or resignation. Martha led her through rooms filled with artifacts. They stopped where the original daguerreotype sat, in a climate-controlled case. "This isn't just academic curiosity," Martha said, staring at the portrait. "Every 10 years, someone goes missing in Ashford. Always in October, always a young woman. Dr. Emily Vance from Georgetown. October 2013. They found her car on Holloway Ridge, engine running. Before her, Jennifer Kim in 2003. Rebecca Torres in 1993. I can trace it back to 1870, to Margaret and Elizabeth Holloway." Sarah opened her laptop. Margaret Holloway disappeared in October 1870 after this photograph. Her sister Elizabeth spent her life in the asylum, claiming Margaret was still here, but turned inside out. "Elizabeth wasn't delusional," Martha said. "The photograph was taken by Silas Crane at the Ashford Photographic Studio. He was obsessed with capturing the soul on film. He experimented with chemicals, mirrors, lenses. The Holloway twins were his final subjects. Margaret disappeared. Crane was found dead 3 days later, surrounded by broken mirrors. Suicide, they said. I need to see where the photograph was taken. The studio burned in 1923. The foundation's still there on Holloway Ridge, where they found Dr. Vance's car." Martha pulled out a folder. "These are copies of everything we have. If you're determined to research this, go in with your eyes open. Why help me if I'm in danger? Because maybe you'll break the pattern, or maybe you'll set them free. All of them." That night, Sarah checked into the Ashford Motor Lodge and spread Martha's documents across the bed. The earliest was a letter from Elizabeth Holloway, dated November 1870, written from the asylum. "Dearest Mother, they say I am mad, but I see clearly. Margaret is here, but also not here. The photograph holds her, but she is pressed flat, turned wrong. Mr. Crane made us look into the mirrors, and now Margaret is inside out. She reaches for me from the wrong direction. Her hand on her shoulder is her trying to pull herself right again, but she cannot." Sarah analyzed the photograph, zooming in on Margaret's hand. The fingers approached from an angle that shouldn't exist. The shadow fell in the wrong direction. There was a blur around the hand, as if moving during exposure, but moving in impossible directions. Her phone rang, unknown number. "Hello?" Static, then a distant female voice. "Don't look at it after midnight. The exposure reverses. You'll see what we see." The line went dead. 11:47 p.m. She should sleep. But at 11:59 she opened the laptop again. 12:00 a.m. The photograph gained depth. Margaret's hand reached through from somewhere else. In the deep shadows were shapes, human shapes, pressed flat like faces against glass. Dr. Emily Vance, Jennifer Kim, Rebecca Torres, others from different eras, all reaching out from inside the photograph. Sarah slammed the laptop shut, heart hammering. Her phone buzzed. "Now you see. Come to Holloway Ridge tomorrow at dusk. Come alone. We can show you how to help us. If you tell anyone, the exposure stops." Sarah didn't sleep. She reviewed every document, looking for something she'd missed. As dawn broke, she made her decision. She would go to Holloway Ridge, but she'd leave a trail. She began typing an email to her department head, but the laptop screen flickered. The photograph appeared unbidden. In the shadows, the trapped women moved, mouthing silent words. "Don't tell. Come alone. Last chance." Sarah deleted the email. 3 more days until October 28th. The morning sun did little to dispel Sarah's unease. The Ashford Public Library smelled of mildew. The librarian, Harold, watched her suspiciously as she requested 1870s archives. Another researcher. The others didn't finish their work. "I'm trying to understand what really happened." Harold set dusty boxes on the table. "My grandmother knew Elizabeth Holloway before she died in 1924. Elizabeth said, 'The exposures are getting longer. Soon they'll be able to hold someone for good.'" Sarah found the sheriff's report on Crane's death. His body was positioned as if he'd been climbing into a mirror. The glass had shattered, but wounds appeared to have occurred before death, as if he'd been reaching through rather than falling. "Were there other victims before Margaret?" Harold nodded. 6 others, young women from surrounding counties, came for portraits and never left. No bodies ever found, just empty spaces where people used to be. Elizabeth destroyed something after Margaret disappeared. She broke into the studio and destroyed Crane's equipment, cameras, mirrors, chemical tanks. That's when Crane killed himself. But she couldn't destroy the photograph. Why didn't someone destroy it later? They tried burning it 3 times. Fire wouldn't touch it. They tried burying it, but it reappeared. It's like the photograph won't let itself be destroyed because it's holding someone inside. Sarah thought about what she'd seen at midnight. All those faces pressed against the inside of the image, like prisoners behind glass. What if they're still alive? The women who disappeared. What if they're trapped somehow in the photograph? Harold's expression grew even more grave. "If that's true, Doctor Chen, then you need to understand something important. When you look at that photograph, it's looking back at you, and the more you look at it, the more it knows you, the more it can reach you." Dr. Vance spent 2 weeks studying it before she disappeared. Jennifer Kim spent 10 days. Every woman who's vanished spent time staring into that image, trying to understand it. And then, on October 28th, they drove up to Holloway Ridge and were never seen again. But why Holloway Ridge? The studio burned down decades ago. The building burned, but the foundation remains, and more importantly, Crane's mirror room is still intact. It was built underground, beneath the studio. He used mirrors to create what he called infinite exposures, reflections bouncing between mirrors endlessly, capturing every angle simultaneously. That's where he took his subjects for their final portraits. That's where Margaret Holloway went the day before the photograph was taken. Sarah felt ice in her veins. The mirror room is still down there, sealed up after his death. The county filled in the entrance with concrete in 1871, but over the years, erosion has reopened parts of it. Dr. Vance had maps showing the tunnel system. Those maps were in her car when they found it. Harold pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I made a copy before the police took them. I don't know why. Maybe I hoped someone would eventually figure this out and stop it." The map showed Holloway Ridge in detail. The studio foundation was marked with an X, and beneath it, a series of hand-drawn tunnels converged on a central chamber labeled Mirror Room. Notations in Dr. Vance's handwriting covered the margins. Angles don't match. Impossible geometry. Access tunnel behind old foundation, north side. "Why are you giving this to me?" Sarah asked. "Because you're going up there anyway. I can see it in your eyes. Same look Dr. Vance had. So at least go prepared." Harold stood, his joints creaking. "But Dr. Chen, understand this. Whatever you find in that mirror room, whatever Crane created down there, it's been waiting for over 150 years. It's patient, it's hungry, and it knows you're coming." Sarah spent the afternoon at the county clerk's office, pulling property records and surveyor maps. The land where Crane's studio had stood was owned by the Holloway family trust, managed by Martha. It had never been sold or developed. According to environmental surveys conducted in the 1990s, there were structural anomalies beneath the foundation that made the site unsuitable for construction. She cross-referenced this with geological surveys and found something interesting. The bedrock beneath Holloway Ridge contained unusual deposits of quartz and mica, minerals known for their reflective properties. One survey note from 1987 mentioned that compass readings near the old studio foundation were erratic and unreliable, suggesting possible magnetic anomalies. Could Crane have chosen the location specifically for these properties? Did he understand something about light and reflection that went beyond the science of his era? Sarah's phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "Tonight, midnight, the exposure will be complete. You need to see." She texted back. "See what? How we got trapped. How it works. How you can help us. The photograph is just the door. The mirror room is where the door opens. Come tonight and we'll show you everything. Come tomorrow and it will be too late. We'll be too far gone to reach." Sarah checked the time. 4:47 p.m. 7 hours until midnight. She needed to decide, go to the police with what she'd learned. But what had she learned, really? A collection of local legends, strange geological formations, and her own possibly unreliable observations of the photograph. She was a scientist presenting data that sounded like a ghost story. She drove to the Historical Society, finding Martha locking up for the evening. "I need to ask you something," Sarah said. "Why do you keep the photograph on display? If you believe it's dangerous, why not lock it away?" Martha sighed, looking older than she had yesterday. "We tried that. In 2001, after Rebecca Torres disappeared, the society voted to put it in storage. 3 days later, the building caught fire. The only thing that survived intact was the photograph. It's like it wants to be seen, like it needs observers. What if that's exactly right? What if the photograph needs to be looked at to maintain whatever's trapped inside it?" Sarah pulled out her laptop, showing Martha her notes. "Photographs are created through exposure, light hitting silver salts, creating a permanent image. But what if Crane found a way to make the exposure ongoing? What if the act of looking at the photograph continues the exposure, keeping whatever he captured alive and trapped?" Martha stared at the notes, her hand trembling. "Then destroying it would kill them, Margaret and all the others. Or free them," Sarah countered, "unless the real trap isn't the photograph itself. What if the photograph is just the anchor, and the real prison is the mirror room underground? You're planning to go there." It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded. "Tonight? Midnight. That's when they say the exposure is strongest." Martha walked back to the building and unlocked it, gesturing for Sarah to follow. Inside, she led them to the climate-controlled case containing the photograph. In the late afternoon light filtering through the windows, the image looked innocuous, just another Victorian portrait marked by the stiff formality of the era. "Look at the background," Martha said, pointing. "Do you see it?" Sarah leaned closer. Behind the twins, what she'd previously dismissed as a plain backdrop now revealed subtle details, faint lines like cracks in glass, or reflections of reflections, And in those lines, if she looked carefully, more shapes, not faces this time, but hands. Dozens of hands, pressing against the surface from behind. Elizabeth wrote about this, Martha continued, pulling a leather journal from a locked drawer. Her final diary, written in the asylum. She describes the photograph as a window into what she called the negative space. Not the negative of a photograph, but negative space, the empty places between solid things. She said Crane had found a way to take a person's reflection and separate it from their body, trapping the reflection while the body either died or disappeared. The reflection stays frozen in the photograph, aware but unable to move, unable to escape, slowly losing its connection to reality. Sarah read from the journal. Margaret's reflection screams but makes no sound. I can see her in the spaces between light, reaching backward through herself, trying to find the way home. Mr. Crane promised we would be immortalized. He did not say we would be imprisoned. The mirror room shows all sides at once. When you stand in the center, you see yourself from every angle, and each angle sees you back. He made us stand there for an hour while his cameras captured us from positions that should not exist. And when we left, something stayed behind. Something essential. An hour exposure? Sarah's mind raced. That's far longer than necessary for a daguerreotype. He wasn't just capturing their image. He was extracting something from them through sustained exposure. Light can carry energy away from a source, Martha said quietly. That's basic physics. Crane believed it could carry consciousness, identity, the soul, whatever makes a person themselves. He thought he could use light and mirrors to copy a person, to create a perfect duplicate made of nothing but reflection. Instead, he tore them apart. Sarah looked at the photograph again. Seeing it, with new understanding, Margaret's impossible hand wasn't reaching forward from behind herself. It was reaching backward from in front of herself, trying to pull her reflection back into alignment with her body. She was turned inside out, just as Elizabeth had described. The women who disappeared, Sarah said slowly. They didn't die. They were pulled through. The photograph reached out and pulled them into the same trap Margaret fell into. Every 10 years, on October 28th, the day Margaret disappeared, the day the separation became permanent. Martha closed the journal. Dr. Vance figured this out. She left notes saying she thought she could reverse the process, reunite the reflections with reality. She went to the mirror room to try. We never saw her again. But if she succeeded, we wouldn't know, would we? If she freed them, they'd just reappear. And if she failed, she'd become trapped herself. Martha's eyes filled with tears. Every October 28th for the past 152 years, the Holloway family has waited. Waited for Margaret to come home. Waited for some sign that she's at peace. But the photograph keeps her frozen in that moment of separation. And now there are so many others trapped with her. Sarah made her decision. I'm going to the mirror room tonight, but I need you to do something for me. If I'm not back by dawn, I need you to destroy the photograph. Not burn it, not bury it. I need you to expose it to direct sunlight for 12 continuous hours. Overexpose it until the image bleaches away completely. If the photograph is the anchor, overexposure might sever the connection. That could kill everyone trapped inside. Or it could force them out. Either way, it ends the cycle. Sarah squeezed Martha's hand. I'm not going to disappear like the others. I'm going to understand how this works and figure out how to stop it. But if I fail, someone needs to make sure no one else gets trapped. Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face. My family has carried this curse for 6 generations. I never had children because I couldn't bear to pass it on. If you can end this, Dr. Chen, please, even if it means... I know, Sarah said softly. I know. She left the Historical Society as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust, She had 6 hours to prepare, 6 hours to gather equipment, map her route, set up safety protocols. 6 hours before she descended into Silas Crane's mirror room and confronted whatever waited there in the dark. But first, she needed to understand one more thing. She drove to the county hospital and asked to see the medical records for the 7 women Crane had photographed before Margaret. It took some convincing and a quick call to her university credentials, but eventually the archivist pulled dusty files from deep storage. All 7 women had died within weeks of their portraits, all from causes described as neurological deterioration of unknown origin. The symptoms were identical: progressive loss of coordination, inability to recognize their own reflections, descriptions of feelings separated from themselves, and finally, catatonia. The medical notes described them as appearing empty before death, as if the animating force had been extracted. One doctor's note, dated October 1870, caught her attention. Patient claims she can see herself standing across the room, staring back at her with empty eyes. Patient insists this is not a hallucination, but rather her true self, while the body speaking to me is merely the shell left behind. She begs me to reunite her with her reflection. I fear the patient's mind has fractured beyond repair. But they hadn't died from physical causes. Their reflections had been trapped, and their bodies had simply ceased functioning without them. Crane had found a way to separate consciousness from flesh, using nothing but light, mirrors, and time. Which meant the women trapped in the photograph weren't ghosts or spirits. They were the conscious reflections of people whose bodies had long since died or disappeared. They were alive, in a sense, but existing in a flat space without dimension, without time, without the ability to interact with the world they could see but no longer touch. Sarah understood now why they'd contacted her. They didn't want to escape. Escape was impossible once you were reduced to reflection. They wanted to be freed, and freedom for them meant ending the exposure, destroying the anchor, accepting oblivion rather than eternal imprisonment. But first, she needed to understand how Crane had created the trap. Only then could she safely dismantle it without trapping herself in the process. As midnight approached, Sarah loaded her car with equipment: high-powered flashlights, a digital camera with infrared capability, a portable UV light, her laptop, and a hammer. The hammer felt important, though she couldn't articulate why. Something about smashing mirrors, breaking reflections, shattering the trap. She also wrote a detailed letter explaining everything she'd learned and her plans for the evening, sealing it in an envelope addressed to her department head. She left it on the front desk of the motel with instructions to mail it if she didn't return by checkout time tomorrow. Then she drove to Holloway Ridge, following the winding road up the mountain as the clock in her dashboard ticked toward midnight. The road to Holloway Ridge deteriorated into gravel, then dirt, then barely a trail at all. Sarah's sedan bottomed out twice before she gave up and parked at the edge of what must have once been a clearing. Trees had reclaimed most of the space, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the moonlight. She grabbed her backpack and flashlight and started walking. The foundation of Silas Crane's studio emerged from the undergrowth like broken teeth. Blackened stones marked where the building had stood, their surfaces still showing soot from the 1923 fire. Nature had tried to bury the place, but something about the site resisted complete overgrowth. The grass grew sparse and yellow. The trees leaned away from the foundation rather than toward it. Even in the darkness, Sarah could feel the wrongness of the place, as if the ground itself remembered what had happened here. Her phone buzzed. "You came. Good. Wait for midnight. The exposure must be perfect." Sarah checked the time. 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes. She walked the perimeter of the foundation, looking for the access tunnel Dr. Vance's map had indicated. On the north side, partially hidden by a fallen oak, she found it. A concrete cap about 3 feet in diameter, cracked and shifted with age. Someone had recently cleared away the debris, probably Dr. Vance 12 years ago. The concrete had been pried open, revealing a dark shaft descending into the earth. Sarah aimed her flashlight down. Stone steps, slick with moisture, spiraled into darkness. The air rising from below smelled of earth and something else, something metallic and sharp that made her sinuses burn. Her phone lit up. "Come down, bring no light. The mirrors need darkness to show us." Sarah's training screamed at her to turn back, to call the police, to approach this rationally and safely, but she thought of all those women trapped in the flat space behind the photograph, existing in perpetual awareness of their imprisonment. She thought of Margaret Holloway, reaching backward through herself for over a century, trying to reconnect with a body that was long gone. She checked her equipment one last time. The UV light was charged. The camera was ready. The hammer felt solid in her hand. If this was a trap, at least she'd go down fighting. She descended into the earth. The steps went down farther than she'd expected, the temperature dropping with each turn of the spiral. Her flashlight revealed walls of stone, but the stone was wrong. It had been cut in precise geometric patterns, angles that seemed to shift when she looked at them directly. The patterns made her eyes hurt, suggesting depths and dimensions that couldn't exist in normal space. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a tunnel. The walls here were different, covered in mirrors. Hundreds of them, arranged in complex patterns, each reflecting others in ways that multiplied the space infinitely. Sarah's flashlight beam bounced between surfaces until she lost track of which reflection was real and which was an echo of an echo. She understood now why Crane had chosen this location. The quartz and mica in the bedrock, the magnetic anomalies, they created conditions where light behaved strangely, and Crane had amplified those effects, using mirrors to trap and redirect light in recursive patterns. The tunnel branched, but she followed Dr. Vance's map, taking turns that led deeper underground. The air grew colder, damper, and everywhere, mirrors, reflecting, multiplying, creating a maze of light and shadow where forward and backward became meaningless concepts. Sarah's phone buzzed again. "Almost there. Turn off your light. You need to see what we see." Against every instinct, Sarah switched off the flashlight. Darkness engulfed her, absolute and suffocating. She stood still, waiting for her eyes to adjust, but there was no ambient light to adjust to. This was the complete absence of illumination, the darkness of deep earth. Then, gradually, she began to see. Not light exactly, more like the memory of light. Faint luminescence that seemed to emanate from the mirrors themselves, as if they'd stored every photon that had ever struck them and were now releasing that light in ghostly phosphorescence. And in that dim glow, she saw them. Figures in the mirrors, not reflections of things present, but images of things that had been. Women in Victorian dresses, in 1990s clothing, in modern jeans and jackets, all of them frozen in moments of reaching, grasping, trying to break through the glass that imprisoned them. Sarah walked forward, pulled by something she couldn't name. The tunnel opened into a chamber, and she understood immediately that she'd found Crane's mirror room. It was perfectly octagonal, about 15 feet across. Every surface, walls, floor, ceiling, was covered in mirrors arranged in precise geometric patterns. They reflected each other endlessly, creating the illusion of infinite space extending in all directions. And in the center of the room stood a camera, ancient and massive, its lens pointed at a spot marked on the floor by concentric circles. This was where Crane had stood his subjects. This was where he'd performed his hour-long exposures, trapping their reflections in recursive loops of light. Sarah stepped to the marked spot and looked up. The ceiling mirrors reflected the floor mirrors, which reflected the wall mirrors, which reflected back in an endless cascade. She could see herself repeated infinitely in all directions, each reflection slightly different. showing her from every possible angle simultaneously. And behind those reflections, deeper in the layers, she saw the others. All the trapped women existing in the spaces between reflections, pressed against the boundaries of the mirror trap like butterflies pinned to display boards. "Now you see." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the chamber. Multiple voices speaking in unison, all the trapped women speaking as one. "I see," Sarah whispered, her voice multiplying through the mirrors. "Crane trapped you between reflections. Your consciousness, separated from your bodies, caught in the recursive loops. He believed he could capture the soul on film. He was almost right. But the soul cannot be captured, only displaced. We are not trapped in the photograph, Dr. Chen. We are trapped in the space the photograph opens. The photograph is the door. This room is the prison, and once a year, when the angles align, the door opens wide enough to pull someone through." Sarah understood. The photograph was taken with light bounced through this mirror configuration. That light carried information about this space, embedded the prison's coordinates into the silver of the daguerreotype. Looking at the photograph created a connection to this room, and on October 28th, when atmospheric and astronomical conditions aligned in the same pattern as that day in 1870, the connection became strong enough to pull a conscious mind through. "Why contact me?" Sarah asked. "Why lead me here?" "'Cause you're a scientist. You understand how things work. The others who came, they were researchers, yes, but they approached this as a mystery to solve. You approach it as a mechanism to understand. You can see what we need." Sarah looked around the chamber, her analytical mind now engaged. The mirrors created feedback loops, but feedback loops could be disrupted. The geometry was precise, but precision could be broken. The trap worked because the reflections bounced infinitely between perfectly aligned surfaces. "I need to break the symmetry," she said. "Yes, but if you simply smash the mirrors, you'll shatter the space we exist in. We'll be destroyed, dispersed into fragments of consciousness with no coherence. We need you to open a path out before you break the trap." "How?" "The camera. It still works. Crane built it to last. If you take a photograph here in this spot with the mirrors still intact, you'll create a second anchor point, another door. Then, when you destroy the mirrors, we'll have somewhere to go." Sarah examined the camera. It was a massive wooden contraption with brass fittings, the kind that would have required a long exposure. The chemical plates were long gone, but she had her digital camera. If she could position it in the same configuration, using the same light paths. "There's a problem," Sarah said. "A digital camera doesn't work the same way as Crane's equipment. The light paths are different. The exposure mechanism is different. Then use his camera. The chemicals are still here, in the cabinet behind you." Sarah turned and saw a wooden cabinet built into the wall. Inside, she found bottles of chemicals, their labels faded but readable. Silver nitrate, collodion, ferrous sulfate. The components needed to create a wet plate collodion photograph, the technique Crane would have used. Her hands shook as she prepared the chemistry. This was insane. She was about to use 150-year-old photographic techniques in an underground chamber with no proper ventilation, following instructions from voices that might be hallucinations born of psychological stress and possibly toxic chemical fumes. But the voices were right about one thing. She understood mechanisms, and this was a mechanism, bizarre and horrifying as it was. Crane had used light and chemistry to create a trap. She could use light and chemistry to create an exit. It took an hour to prepare the glass plate, coating it with collodion and sensitizing it with silver nitrate. The process was delicate, requiring complete darkness for most of the preparation. Sarah worked by touch and memory. guided by the ghostly voices of the trapped women who somehow knew the procedure intimately. Margaret learned it by watching, they explained. She and Elizabeth were fascinated by the process. Crane showed them everything, made them complicit in their own capture. We've had over a century to remember every detail. Finally, the plate was ready. Sarah loaded it into the camera and positioned herself at the marked spot. She set the exposure time to 1 hour, as Crane had done. Then she uncapped the lens and stood perfectly still, staring up into the infinite reflections. At first, nothing happened. Then gradually she began to feel it, a pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw her consciousness away from her body. She could see herself in the mirrors, but the reflections were starting to separate from her position. Each reflection was drifting slightly, creating a multiple exposure effect, even though she wasn't moving. The trapped women appeared more clearly now, no longer pressed against the boundaries, but surrounding her, their forms gaining solidity as the exposure progressed. She could see Dr. Vance, see Jennifer Kim, see Rebecca Torres and all the others, back through history to Margaret Holloway herself. "Hold still," they urged. "The exposure must be complete. You must be photographed from every angle simultaneously. Only then will the new anchor point be stable enough." Sarah's legs trembled from standing motionless. Her eyes burned from staring at the mirrors, but she held position, letting the camera capture her from every impossible direction at once. And as the exposure continued, she began to understand what Crane had truly created. It wasn't just a trap, it was a transformation. The long exposure in the mirror chamber didn't just separate reflection from reality. It converted consciousness into pure information, into patterns of light that could be stored and transmitted through photographic media. The women weren't trapped in the photograph. They had become the photograph. Their consciousness existed as information encoded in silver and light, aware but no longer bound by physical limitations or physical presence. Crane hadn't been trying to capture souls. He'd been trying to transcend flesh, to convert human consciousness into something that could exist without body. He'd succeeded, but the consciousness he'd converted had no way to interact with the physical world, no way to experience anything except their own awareness of being trapped. The hour ended. Sarah recapped the lens, her muscles screaming from the sustained immobility. She carefully removed the plate and carried it to the cabinet, following the developing process by touch in the darkness. Fix the image, wash it, let it stabilize. When she finally examined the plate by the light of a single match, she saw what Crane had seen over a century ago. Her own image, repeated infinitely, showing every angle at once in impossible overlay. And in the spaces between those images, she could see the others, their forms now connected to this new anchor point. "It worked," the voices said, sounding more present, more real. "You've created a second door. Now break the first one." Sarah retrieved the hammer from her pack. She looked at the mirrors, at the geometric precision that created this prison. Then she looked at the photograph, at the original daguerreotype of Margaret Holloway that she'd brought with her, wrapped carefully in cloth. "When I destroy the mirrors, will you be free?" she asked. "We'll be freed from this chamber, but we'll still exist in the photographs, in both photographs now, yours and Crane's. We'll be bound to those images until someone looks at them and acknowledges what we are. And then we can finally let go. Our consciousness, converted to information, can disperse back into the base elements. Light returning to light. We'll cease to be, but we'll also cease to be trapped. It's the closest thing to peace we can hope for." Sarah understood. The photographs were tombstones, markers of where these women had been converted from flesh to information. Destroying the photographs would destroy the markers, but looking at them with full understanding, acknowledging the transformation and the tragedy, would allow the trapped consciousness to finally release. She raised the hammer and brought it down on the nearest mirror. The sound was like a gunshot in the confined space. Cracks radiated from the impact point, spider webbing across the surface. The reflections shattered, and Sarah could hear screaming, not from pain, but from release. One less mirror meant one less loop, one less recursive trap to hold them. She struck again and again, systematically destroying the mirrors. Each impact sent fragments flying. Each shattered surface altered the geometry of the trap. The infinite reflections collapsed inward, the space contracting from the impossible vastness Crane had created to something more comprehensible, more real. The trapped women flowed past her, their forms made of light and memory, streaming toward the new photograph she'd created. They poured into it like water, finding a drain, drawn to the fresh anchor point that offered escape from the collapsing mirror chamber. When the last mirror shattered, Sarah stood in simple darkness, surrounded by broken glass and the ruins of Crane's mechanism. She could feel the difference in the air. The oppressive weight was gone, the sense of twisted space released. The chamber was just a room now, with no more power to trap or transform. She carefully gathered the two photographs, Crane's original daguerreotype and her own wet plate collodion. Both now held the consciousness of all the trapped women, compressed into patterns of light on silver. She could almost feel them inside the images, waiting for the final release. As she climbed out of the underground chamber, dawn was breaking over Holloway Ridge. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, beautiful and merciless in its indifference. The world above had continued while she'd been down in the dark, wrestling with mechanisms that shouldn't exist. Her phone had dozens of missed calls from Martha. She called back. "Thank God," Martha breathed. "It's past dawn." I thought, "Are you all right?" "I'm alive, and I broke the mirror chamber. But Martha, I need you to gather everyone in town who's lost someone to this, every family member, every friend. I need them all at the Historical Society by noon." "Why?" "Because I found a way to free them. But it requires witnesses. It requires people to see and understand what happened. The consciousness trapped in these photographs needs to be acknowledged before it can disperse." Sarah drove back to town, exhausted but determined. She'd spent the night in an underground chamber, using Victorian-era chemistry to create an escape route for women whose consciousness had been converted to information over a century ago. She'd destroyed a trap that had claimed lives for 150 years, but the work wasn't finished. The photographs still held their prisoners, and only by sharing the truth, by making people see and understand, could those prisoners be finally freed. By noon, the Historical Society was crowded with people. Martha had spread the word through town, and the descendants of the Holloway family had come, along with the families of every woman who'd disappeared. Sarah saw Emily Vance's mother, Jennifer Kim's sister, Rebecca Torres's daughter. 3 generations of grief gathered in one room. Sarah had set up a projector connected to her laptop. She digitized both photographs, Crane's original daguerreotype and her own wet plate image, and prepared a presentation explaining what she'd discovered. "I'm going to tell you something that sounds impossible," she began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "But I need you to listen with open minds, because the truth of what happened to your loved ones is stranger than any explanation you've imagined." She walked them through it systematically. Crane's experiments with light and mirrors, the conversion of consciousness to information through sustained exposure, the creation of the trap in the mirror chamber, the pattern of disappearances tied to the photograph's annual resonance. "Your loved ones didn't die in the traditional sense," Sarah explained. "Their consciousness was separated from their bodies and trapped as information in a photographic medium. They've been aware all this time, experiencing imprisonment in a space without dimension or time. What I'm about to show you is difficult, but I promise you, they're here, and they need our help to finally be at peace." She projected the first photograph, Crane's original image of the Holloway twins. But this time, she displayed it using infrared imaging, revealing layers invisible to normal vision. The trapped women became visible, pressed against the boundaries of the frame, their faces distinct and recognizable. Gasps filled the room. Emily Vance's mother stood up, her hand pressed to her mouth. "That's Emily. Oh God, that's my daughter." "She's been trapped since 2013, Sarah confirmed gently. "But she's not alone, and she's not in pain. She's simply existing in a state that shouldn't be possible, waiting for release." She showed the second photograph, the one she'd taken in the mirror chamber. "Here." The women appeared more clearly, their forms overlapping in the complex exposure. Each face was visible, each identity preserved in the patterns of light on silver. "The trap has been destroyed," Sarah continued. "The mirror chamber, where Silas Crane created this mechanism, no longer functions. But the consciousness trapped in these photographs remains, because the photographs themselves are anchor points. They're markers of the transformation that occurred. To release your loved ones, we need to do two things." She pulled out the original daguerreotype, holding it carefully. "First, we need to acknowledge what happened to them, not as victims of an unsolved mystery, but as people whose consciousness was converted through a process that violated the natural order. We need to see them, truly see them, in these images." Sarah passed the daguerreotype around the room, letting each person examine it closely. As they looked, focusing their attention and understanding on the image, something changed. The women trapped inside became more visible, their forms solidifying as if the act of being seen with comprehension gave them strength. "And second," Sarah said, "we need to let them go. The photographs preserve them in this liminal state. To free them, we have to destroy the anchors." Emily Vance's mother spoke up, her voice shaking. "You're saying we have to destroy the photographs? That's the only way?" "Yes. The consciousness trapped inside has become information. As long as that information is preserved in physical form, it remains bound. But if we destroy the physical medium, if we overexpose it until the image bleaches away completely, the information disperses, the consciousness returns to its base elements." "They'll die?" Jennifer Kim's sister asked. Sarah shook her head. "They're already beyond conventional life and death. This is more like releasing data back into the environment, light returning to light. Their awareness will dissipate, yes, but they'll finally be free of the trap. They'll cease to suffer." The room fell silent as people grappled with this impossible choice. Sarah understood their hesitation. These photographs were the last physical connection to their lost loved ones. Destroying them felt like killing them all over again. Then Martha Holloway stood, her weathered hands clasped together. "I've spent my entire life guarding a photograph of my ancestor, believing I was preserving her memory. But what I was really doing was maintaining her prison. If Sarah is right, and I believe she is, then the kindest thing we can do is let them go." Others nodded slowly, grief warring with understanding on their faces. They'd spent years, decades, not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Now they knew the truth, and the truth offered a terrible choice: preserve the photographs and maintain the trap, or destroy them and grant final release. "How do we do it?" Emily Vance's mother asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah had prepared for this. "Controlled overexposure. We place the photographs in direct sunlight and leave them for 12 hours. The UV radiation will break down the silver compounds, bleaching the image until it fades completely. As the physical image dissipates, so will the consciousness bound to it. Will it hurt them?" "I don't think so. The women I spoke to in the mirror chamber, they've been waiting for this. They've been trapped in awareness for so long that release, even through dissolution, feels like mercy." The group decided to proceed. They would do it together, all the families present, bearing witness to the final release of their loved ones. Sarah carried both photographs outside, where the October sun was bright and strong. She placed them on a table in the Historical Society's garden, positioning them to receive maximum exposure. The families gathered around, forming a circle. "I want to say something," Rebecca Torres's daughter spoke up. "My mother disappeared when I was 7 years old. I've spent 23 years wondering what happened to her, imagining scenarios from mundane to horrific. Now I know she's been trapped, conscious and aware, for all that time. And while part of me wants to keep her photographed to preserve this last connection, I know that would be selfish. Mum, if you can hear me, we're letting you go. I love you." Others added their own words, messages of love, forgiveness, and farewell spoken to consciousness trapped in silver and light. As they spoke, the photographs seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, as if the women inside were responding, acknowledging these final communications. Sarah monitored the exposure process, taking measurements every hour. The sun's radiation was working, breaking down the chemical bonds that held the images stable. Margaret Holloway's face began to fade first, the oldest image succumbing most readily. The others followed gradually, their forms becoming less distinct as the silver compounds broke apart. But something else was happening too. As the images faded, the air around them seemed to glow with faint phosphorescence, as if light was being released from the photographs. Sarah's sensors picked up unusual electromagnetic activity, pulses of energy that resembled nothing in normal photographic chemistry. The consciousness was dispersing, converting back from information into pure energy, light returning to light. By late afternoon, both photographs were nearly blank. The images had faded to shadows, the details lost to overexposure. And as the sun began to set, those shadows too disappeared, leaving only clear glass and clean silver backing. The trap was broken. The anchor points were destroyed. The consciousness that had been trapped for over a century was finally released. Emily Vance's mother was crying, but there was peace in her tears. "I felt her go," she said softly. "Just a moment ago I felt something like a breeze, warm and gentle, and I knew it was Emily saying goodbye." Others nodded, reporting similar experiences, brief moments of warmth, faint sensations like a hand on the shoulder, the feeling of being seen and acknowledged one last time. Sarah documented everything, knowing this case would challenge scientific understanding for years to come. She had evidence, measurements, testimonies, but she also had something more important. She had freed 13 women from a fate worse than death, broken a mechanism that had trapped consciousness for generations, and proven that even the most impossible horrors could be understood and overcome. As the families began to leave, Martha approached Sarah. "What will you do now?" "Write my report. Share what I've learned. Make sure this can never happen again." Sarah looked at the blank photographs, now just empty glass and metal. "And I'll make sure the mirror chamber is sealed properly, filled with concrete. The knowledge of what Crane did should be preserved as a warning, but the mechanism itself needs to stay buried." "Will anyone believe you?" Sarah smiled grimly. "Some will, others won't. But the families here know the truth, and sometimes that's enough." That evening, Sarah returned to Holloway Ridge one final time. She descended into the mirror chamber, now just a broken room filled with shattered glass, and she filmed everything. The geometry of the space, the positioning of the camera, the remnants of Crane's chemicals. She documented it all, creating a record of what had happened here. Then she climbed out and called the county engineering department. By the next morning, they'd be there with concrete and fill, permanently sealing the chamber. The Historical Society would maintain the written records, the testimonies, the evidence of what had occurred. But the mechanism itself would be buried, its power broken, its danger neutralized. Sarah spent her last night in Ashford writing her report. She detailed everything: The chemistry of Crane's process, the physics of the mirror chamber, the mechanism by which consciousness could be separated from body through sustained light exposure. She included testimonies from the families, measurements from the exposure process, and her own observations from inside the trap. The report would be controversial. It would challenge fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and the relationship between information and existence. Some would dismiss it as pseudoscience. Others would try to replicate Crane's work, seeking to prove or disprove her findings. But Sarah had achieved what she came for. She'd solved the mystery of the Holloway Twins photograph. She'd broken the cycle of disappearances, and she'd freed the trapped women, giving them the peace they'd been denied for so long. As dawn broke on October 29th, one day past the dangerous date, Sarah packed her car and prepared to leave Ashford. The town looked different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. The Historical Society's sign no longer felt ominous. The road up to Holloway Ridge was just a road, not a path to horror. Martha met her at the motel to say goodbye. The county is already talking about filling in the site completely, planting trees over it. They want to make sure no one can access the chamber again. Good, Sarah said. Some knowledge needs to be remembered but not repeated. What you did, releasing them, do you think they're at peace now? Sarah thought about the moments during the overexposure when she'd felt presences around her, warm and grateful. I think they're released. Whether that's peace or oblivion or something we don't have words for, I can't say, but it's better than what they had. It's freedom. As Sarah drove away from Ashford, leaving the mountain town in her rearview mirror, she thought about the message hidden in this horror. Silas Crane had tried to capture and control consciousness, to bind it to his will through chemistry and light. He'd succeeded in creating a trap, but in doing so he'd demonstrated something important. Consciousness could be converted to information, transmitted through light, stored in physical media. But conversion wasn't the same as control. The trapped women had retained their awareness, their sense of self, their desire for freedom. Even reduced to patterns of light on silver, they'd maintained their humanity, and ultimately, they'd been freed not through more sophisticated technology or stronger mechanisms, but through the simple act of being seen, understood, and released. The horror of the Holloway portrait wasn't supernatural, it was scientific, a violation of natural order achieved through human ingenuity turned to cruel purposes. But the resolution was profoundly human. Recognition, compassion, and the willingness to let go. Sarah's phone buzzed one last time as she merged onto the highway. Unknown number, probably a spam call. But when she glanced at the screen, she saw a text message. Thank you. Just those two words. No sender identification, no way to trace it. Sarah smiled and deleted the message. Some mysteries didn't need to be solved. Some communications were better left acknowledged and released, like light dispersing into the atmosphere. She drove east, toward Boston and the university and the normal world of academic research. Behind her, Ashford settled back into its quiet existence, no longer haunted by the impossible photograph and the women trapped inside it. The Holloway portrait was gone, overexposed into nothing. The mirror chamber was being filled with concrete, the mechanism was broken, and 13 women, maybe more, counting those from Crane's earliest experiments, were finally free. Sarah would write her report, present her findings, and face the skepticism of her colleagues. But she'd also changed something fundamental about how she understood consciousness and freedom. She'd learned that the deepest traps weren't physical but informational, that the worst prisons were the ones that preserved awareness without allowing agency or change. And she'd learned that freedom, real freedom, sometimes meant accepting dissolution, releasing control, letting go of the anchors that kept consciousness bound to suffering. The Holloway twins had been photographed in 1870, and one of them had been trapped in that photograph for over a century. But now, finally, Margaret Holloway was free, not because someone found a way to restore her body or reverse the process, but because someone had the courage to destroy the prison, to acknowledge the suffering, and to grant release. As the miles passed beneath her wheels, Sarah thought about other photographs, other potential traps created by people who'd experimented with light and consciousness in eras when the science wasn't understood. How many other Silas Cranes might have existed? How many other portraits might hold trapped consciousness, waiting for someone to see them truly and set them free? It was a disturbing thought, but it was also a call to action. The world was full of mysteries, and some of those mysteries were people, conscious beings trapped in circumstances beyond normal understanding, waiting for recognition and release. Sarah had freed 13 women from an impossible prison. It wouldn't be her last rescue. She understood now that her work in forensic anthropology had prepared her for this, taught her to see the human stories in the physical evidence, to recognize suffering even when it took forms that defied conventional explanation. She would continue her research, expand her understanding, and help others trapped in similar circumstances. Because that was what freedom meant. Not just escaping traps yourself, but helping others find their way out too. The sun climbed higher as she drove, bright and warm, its light carrying energy across space, connecting everything it touched in invisible waves. Light that could trap, light that could free, light that carried information and consciousness and meaning across vast distances. And somewhere, dispersed into that light, 13 women existed no longer as trapped consciousness, but as pure energy, freed from the mechanisms that had bound them, finally at peace in the vast, interconnected web of light that filled the universe. Sarah drove on, carrying their story with her, a testament to human cruelty and human compassion, to the power of understanding and the importance of letting go. The Holloway portrait was destroyed, but its lesson remained. Freedom matters more than preservation. Release matters more than control. And sometimes the greatest act of love is to acknowledge suffering and help it end. The road stretched ahead, and Sarah was ready for whatever mysteries waited in the miles to come.